All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Excited to be here.
Today, we're cracking open Varroc Engineering Ltd's second quarter FY25 financials.
Hot off the press as of today, November 13th, 2024.
We've got the press releases, those detailed financial statements.
And they even put together a pretty slick investor presentation.
Yeah, a full-on picture of what's going on with this global auto tech company.
That's right.
And, we're not just going to look at the numbers, right? We're going to try to figure out what the story is behind them.
The why behind the what.
Exactly. What's driving their growth? What challenges are they facing?
Maybe even get a little sneak peek into their future plans.
Yeah, what's their strategy looking like?
Exactly.
So before we get into all that,
Sure.
for anyone who's maybe not super familiar with Varroc, what's their deal?
So think major player in the auto industry. We're talking $910 million in revenue just in FY24 alone. They're into everything from electrical systems to lighting, all those cool polymer and metallic components you see in cars.
Okay.
And they're even dabbling in some really cutting-edge stuff like ADAS, the Advanced Driver Assistance Systems.
Right.
All those smarts that are making cars safer and more, smart.
So basically, if it's in a car, they probably make it.
Pretty much. They've got a global footprint, 39 facilities worldwide, over 7,000 employees.
Wow.
And over 100 patents across 8 countries.
That's impressive. But their main manufacturing base is in India, right?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. They're global, but with a very strong Indian anchor. 87% of their business comes from India.
Huh. Global but grounded. I like that.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into those Q2 numbers then.
Let's do it.
Revenue growth, what's the story there?
Overall, really healthy. 10.3% jump year over year, bringing them to 20,808 million rupees. And as you might guess, India is the real driving force behind that growth, a whopping 13.4% increase.
So riding that Indian auto market wave, it seems, but it sounds like their global operations didn't have quite as good of a quarter.
Yeah, unfortunately not. Actually saw some negative growth there this time around.
Interesting. Well, revenue is only one side of the coin, right? Got to flip it over and look at profitability.
Right.
Their press release talks about PBT margins, EBITDA margins. I'm already starting to get a little lost in the acronym.
Yeah, those can be a bit confusing. PBT, that stands for profit before tax. And EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Both are ways to measure profitability.
Okay.
But EBITDA gives you a clearer picture of their operating performance, what's happening on the ground.
Gotcha, that helps. So, what does the profitability picture look like for Varroc then?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. Their Q2 FY25 PBT margin came in at 4.4%.
Okay.
Which is up from 3.9% the same quarter last year.
That's good.
Yeah, so that's a positive sign. But their EBITDA margin actually dipped a bit, down to 9.7% from 9.9%.
Interesting. So one's up, one's down. What does that tell us?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because that dip in EBITDA could actually be a good thing in disguise. It might mean their cost-cutting measures are starting to take effect, leading to that improvement in PBT.
Cost-cutting, huh? Makes sense given the, current global economic climate.
Exactly. Companies are having to get lean and mean to stay competitive.
Right. Any other bigger trends we should be aware of when we're looking at their profitability?
Well, zooming out a bit and looking at the first half of the fiscal year, their PBT margin is down slightly year over year.
Okay.
From 3.8% to 3.7%. So it looks like managing costs is probably a big focus for them right now.
Definitely makes sense. All right, so let's dig into the why behind these numbers. What's happening in the Indian auto market that might be impacting Varroc's performance?
Well, the data from the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, or SIAM, paints a pretty interesting picture.
Yeah.
Overall, things are looking up, but it really depends on what type of vehicle we're talking about.
Okay, so it's segment specific. That makes sense. What segments are doing well, and how does that relate to what Varroc actually sells?
Two-wheelers and three-wheelers are booming. Think motorcycles, scooters, auto rickshaws.
Right.
And that's likely good news for Varroc because they supply a lot of parts for those types of vehicles.
More vehicles on the road, more parts needed.
Yeah, exactly. Simple supply and demand.
But you said it depends on the segment. What about other types of vehicles?
Passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles actually saw some declines.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not great news for those sectors. But here's a hopeful sign for Varroc. Quarter-over-quarter growth is actually positive across most segments.
Okay.
So that suggests that Q3 could be even better for them.
Interesting, interesting. All right, well, we can't talk about the auto industry without addressing the
The EV elephant in the room.
exactly. SIAM data shows a massive surge in electric two-wheeler volume, like 73.9% quarter over quarter. How's Varroc positioned to ride that EV wave?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Well, if we look at how the revenue breaks down, it's still heavily dominated by those more traditional segments. 37.1% electrical, 31.4% electronics, 11.9% lighting.
Yep.
And here's a key point. They're heavily reliant on just a few big customers, Bajaj being the biggest one at 45.3% of their revenue.
Yeah, that does seem like a lot riding on one customer. What happens if that relationship changes or if Bajaj starts focusing more on EVs themselves?
Yeah, that's definitely a risk to consider. It provides stability in the short term, but can make them vulnerable to shifts in the market. But to answer your question about EVs, Varroc is making moves. They're increasingly supplying parts to EV makers. About 12% of their Q2 revenue came from EV customers and 9.2% for the first half of the year overall. So they're in the game, but there's definitely room to grow.
Okay, so they're dipping their toes in the EV pool, but let's move past this quarter and look at the bigger picture.
hmm
What are some of the things Varroc's doing strategically that give us a hint about their future plans?
Well, their new business wins are really encouraging. In the first half of FY25 alone, they secured 32.48 billion rupees in new lifetime orders.
Yeah.
And get this, 37% of that is coming from EV players.
Wow, that's huge.
Right, it's a clear signal they're serious about this market.
Yeah, definitely. But what about specific products? Are they developing any cool new technologies in the EV space?
Oh, absolutely. Their investor presentation highlights some really interesting stuff. For instance, they've got this thing called an integrated starter generator, or ISG for short. It's a really clever solution that replaces multiple components in traditional engines, boosting efficiency.
So they're innovating, making things leaner and more efficient.
Exactly.
What else is catching your eye?
They've also developed this new two-stage soft covering process for interiors. You know how everyone wants that luxury car experience these days?
Yeah.
This is Varroc's way of tapping into that trend. They're using this process to create a really high-end look and feel inside the vehicle.
Oh, very nice. Any other cool tech we should know about?
Definitely. They're working on a battery management system, or BMS. That's absolutely crucial for EVs. It's essentially the brains of the battery, making sure it's operating safely and at peak performance. And they're also developing interior ambient lighting systems, adding that personalized touch to the driving experience.
So all the hot new features, but all this takes money, right? What's their CapEx spending looking like?
Yeah, innovation isn't cheap. They spent 1,030 million rupees in the first half of FY25, and they're planning to ramp up spending even more in the second half.
Okay, so they're putting their money where their mouth is, but where exactly is all that money going?
Well, they're expanding their electronics capacity to keep up with the demand for all those smart car features.
Right.
They're also focusing on EV powertrain components, and they're even acquiring land for future growth. They're playing the long game.
Makes sense. Spending is one thing, but what about their overall financial health? What should we be paying attention to?
Their net debt has actually decreased by 1,554 million rupees in the first half of FY25, down to 8,273 million.
Okay, that's a good sign. Anything else?
Yeah. Their net debt to equity ratio is improving, which shows they're getting their financial house in order. And their annualized return on capital employed, or ROCE, sits at a pretty solid 19%.
Very nice. But it's not all about profits these days, right? Sustainability is a big deal. What's Varroc doing on that front, the whole ESG thing?
Oh, they're definitely highlighting their efforts.
Yeah.
One that stands out is their Calm River Restoration Project. It's actually won awards on a global scale.
Wow, that's impressive. What's so special about it?
It's not just about cleaning up a river. It's about a much more holistic approach to, well, environmental and social rejuvenation, I guess you could say. They're combining ecological restoration with community engagement.
Oh, nice.
And it's become a model that other companies are looking to follow.
So it's not just a PR stunt. They're actually making a tangible difference.
Oh, absolutely. They've removed tons of garbage, planted thousands of trees, and created these beautiful biodiversity parks along the river. But they've also involved the local community in the whole process, raising awareness about environmental stewardship.
I love it when companies actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Me too. It's refreshing to see.
It's not just the Calm River project, right? They've got other sustainability initiatives going on, too.
Yeah, for sure. They're actively working on waste management, renewable energy, employee well-being, It seems like they're taking a really comprehensive approach to ESG, which is great to see.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. Before we move on to part two, what are some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those who are all about those aha moments?
Well, I think one big takeaway is that Varroc is riding that Indian auto market wave, especially when it comes to two-wheelers and EVs.
Right.
They're winning new business, particularly from those EV players, which is positioning them well for future growth. And they're not afraid to invest in new technologies,
Yeah.
expanding their capacity to support that growth,
Right.
all while they're tackling their debt
Mm.
and making a real effort on sustainability.
Very impressive. Now, here's a thought-provoking question to ponder as we head into part two. The global auto industry is changing rapidly, and the shift to EVs is accelerating. Will Varroc's strategic bets pay off in the long run? What should investors be watching closely?
Lots to think about.
Stay tuned because we'll be diving deeper into those questions and more in the next part of our deep dive.
Can't wait. You know, it is fascinating to think about those strategic bets,
Yeah.
especially in the context of like the global auto industry as a whole,
Yeah.
you know?
Right, because it's not exactly smooth sailing out there.
Not at all. It's a time of like massive upheaval. This whole shift to EVs is happening way faster than anyone really predicted.
Yeah.
And you've got traditional automakers scrambling to adapt.
Right.
Then you throw in like supply chain issues, rising material costs, geopolitical uncertainty. I mean, it's a lot to handle.
Yeah, no kidding. So how does all of this impact a company like Varroc?
Right?
I mean, they're trying to grow, but they're doing it in the middle of, like, a whirlwind.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to change a tire while driving down the highway at 100 miles an hour.
Oh, I like that analogy. So with all these external pressures, what should investors be keeping an eye on when it comes to Varroc's strategy?
Well, I think first and foremost, how quickly can they ramp up their EV production?
Right.
Can they get the necessary raw materials, build out the capacity they need to meet that like surging EV demand?
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about their existing business? I mean, can they keep things profitable in those, like, traditional segments while also pouring so much money into these new technologies?
That's the million-dollar token, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
they can't afford to neglect their core business,
Right.
but they also can't fall behind in the EV race. Right?
Yeah.
It's a very delicate balancing act. Yeah.
For sure. And let's not forget about those customer relationships. You mentioned earlier that they're pretty reliant on a few key clients, like Bajaj.
Right.
What happens if those relationships sour or if those clients start focusing more on EVs themselves?
Yeah, that's a real risk. Customer concentration can be a real, double-edged sword, right? It
Yeah.
provides stability in the short term, but it can also leave you vulnerable to big market shifts. Varroc really needs to diversify its customer base to mitigate that risk for sure.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. So lots of challenges, but also lots of potential. Sounds like it's going to be a wild ride for Varroc and really for the whole auto industry.
Oh, absolutely. This is like a pivotal moment for the entire sector. And for companies like Varroc, it all comes down to, making the right bets and then executing flawlessly.
Well said. Okay, so we've talked big picture, but let's zoom back in on those Q2 results for a minute.
Yep.
What really stood out to you besides those impressive new business wins with EV players? I mean,
What's interesting to me is that despite those, overall positive trends in India's auto market, Varroc's overseas operations are really struggling.
yeah.
Remember, they actually saw negative growth this quarter.
Yeah, we touched on that a little bit earlier. What's the deal there? Is it just the tough global environment, or is there something more specific to Varroc's overseas business?
It's probably a combination of factors, to be honest. I mean, the global auto industry is facing headwinds like everywhere you look,
Right.
but Varroc's overseas operations might be particularly vulnerable because, remember, they're a relatively small player in those markets,
Right.
especially compared to their dominant position in India.
Yeah, they only make about 13% of their revenue outside of India.
Exactly. So they're going up against some really big established players.
Yeah.
And it's possible that their product mix or their cost structure just isn't as competitive in those markets.
Okay.
Plus, they're dealing with currency fluctuations, which can really eat into their profits.
So a tougher battle overseas, for sure. What are they doing to address those challenges? Did they say anything about that in their reports?
They didn't really go into specifics about their overseas strategy.
Yep.
But they did mention investing in research and development for future growth in those markets.
Okay.
So Yeah, they're not throwing in the towel just yet.
Well, hopefully those investments start paying off soon. Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about something I always find uh, fascinating, and that's the human element.
Right.
We mentioned Varroc's Calm River Restoration Project briefly earlier,
Yeah.
but I kind of want to dig a little deeper.
Sure.
What makes this project so special that it's winning awards on a global scale?
Well, like we said before, it goes way beyond just cleaning up a river.
Right.
It's really about a holistic approach to environmental and social rejuvenation.
Okay.
They've kind of created a model that other companies could learn from, I think.
So it's not just a PR stunt, they're actually making a real difference.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They've removed tons of garbage, planted thousands of trees, and created these, like, amazing biodiversity parks along the river.
Mm-hmm.
But they've also, involved the local community in the process,
Right.
raising awareness about environmental stewardship. It's a win-win.
Yeah. I love it when companies actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Me too. Me too.
It's not just the Calm River project, though, right? They've got other sustainability initiatives in the works.
Yeah, they're actively working on waste management, renewable energy, employee well-being. It seems like they're taking a very comprehensive approach to ESG, which is great to see.
It is. It is.
Right.
Okay, so zooming out for a minute, we've talked a lot about the challenges and the opportunities facing Varroc.
Right.
But what about the people involved?
Yeah.
I mean, what about the thousands of employees who work for this company? How are they impacted by all these strategic shifts?
Right.
And what role do they play in Varroc's success or failure?
Yeah, that's such an important point. We often get so caught up in the numbers and the technology, but behind every successful company, there are people, right?
Mhm.
People with the skills and the knowledge and the dedication to make it all happen.
Mhm.
And in times of like massive change, their role becomes even more critical, I think.
Absolutely. So as we move on to part three, let's keep that human element in mind, because ultimately it's the people who drive innovation, who adapt to these new challenges, and who really build the companies of the future.
Couldn't agree more.
It's fascinating, thinking about all these folks that make this happen.
Yeah.
I noticed Varroc's investor presentation actually highlights their employee training and development program.
Right. They've got this whole thing called the Varroc Academy,
Oh, okay.
and it focuses specifically on, upskilling their workforce, especially in areas like digitalization and advanced manufacturing.
So they're actively trying to prepare their employees for the future, especially for this, massive shift towards EVs.
Absolutely. I mean, if they want to be a leader in the EV space, they need to have like a workforce that's ready to go.
Right.
It's not just about, having the latest technology. It's about having people who can use it, design it, keep up with this crazy pace of change.
Yeah. It's all about that human capital, for sure.
Absolutely.
I bet there are some incredible stories within Varroc
Oh, yeah.
of people who are right there on the front lines of this whole EV revolution.
Right. Imagine the engineers who are like designing those complex battery systems, or the technicians who are, learning how to assemble those electric motors.
Yeah.
They're the real unsung heroes
Yeah.
who are like driving this whole transformation.
Yeah, for sure. You know what? We should try to talk to some of those folks for a future episode.
Oh, that would be so cool.
Get a real behind the scenes perspective on what this, what this shift actually feels like on the ground.
Yeah, I'd love to hear their insights, what their day-to-day is like.
Okay, let's zoom back out again for a minute.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about Varroc's plans.
Right.
But what about their competition?
Yeah.
I mean, who else is in this race to be like a top EV supplier?
Well, it's a crowded field, that's for sure.
Yeah.
You've got like those big established players, companies like Bosch and Continental,
Right.
who are also pouring tons of resources into EV tech.
Okay.
And then you have like a whole bunch of startups popping up. Some of them are, focusing on very specific niches within the EV world.
So it's a real mix of old and new, big and small.
Yeah, exactly.
How does a company like Varroc stand out in that kind of environment?
I think one of their biggest advantages is their deep understanding of the Indian market.
Okay.
They know what Indian consumers want,
Right.
and that market is expected to see a huge surge in, EV adoption over the next few years.
Mhm.
And then, they also have those strong, long-standing relationships with those major car manufacturers in India,
Okay.
which, gives them a lot of credibility, and it helps them scale their operations.
So local expertise, strong partnerships.
Yeah.
Very cool. But what about pricing?
Yeah.
I mean, can they compete on cost with these global giants?
That's where their manufacturing base in India really helps.
Oh,
They've got access to, a large and skilled workforce.
right.
And labor costs are, relatively lower there compared to some of their global competitors.
Makes sense.
But they also need to keep pushing for like operational efficiency
Yeah.
and invest in automation to really stay ahead of the curve.
It's a constant race to innovate and to improve.
It really is. But it's also, it's super exciting to watch.
It is.
This is like a once in a generation shift happening in the auto industry.
Yeah.
And companies like Varroc are like right there in the thick
Yeah.
of it.
They are. They are. Well, I think we've given our listeners a pretty thorough deep dive into Varroc Engineering today.
Yeah, I think so.
We've explored their financials, their strategies, their approach to sustainability, and even touched on the human side of this whole story.
Right, right.
As we wrap up, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Varroc is, they're at a really pivotal moment.
Yeah.
They've made some pretty big bets on the future of mobility.
Uh-huh.
And if they play their cards right, those bets could pay off big time.
All right.
But there are also some serious challenges, both, within the company and in the wider world.
Yeah, for sure.
So these next few years are going to be crucial in determining whether they can truly become like a major player in the EV space.
Well said. And for anyone who wants to dive even deeper, I definitely encourage you to check out those source documents we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, good idea.
There's a ton of information in those reports. You might even discover some interesting insights that we didn't have time to cover.
Absolutely.
And, don't be afraid to do your own research, too.
Right.
Read industry articles, follow the news, talk to experts.
Yeah, the more you learn about this industry and this whole EV revolution, the better you'll be able to, really understand the complexities of a company like Varroc.
Great advice. And remember, the auto industry is constantly evolving.
Always changing.
So what we discussed today is just, a snapshot in time.
Yeah, for sure.
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay tuned for more deep dives into this fascinating world of business and technology.
Absolutely. Can't wait.
Thanks for joining us.
It was my pleasure.